At 3 years old, Isaac Newton's mother left him. Years later, the same boy was told to forget school and become a farmer. He failed at that too. But then a deadly plague forced him into isolation. And during those lonely months, Newton began thinking about a question that would change the universe. So, what exactly happened in that farmhouse? Stay with me. Before Isaac Newton became the man we know today, he was just a little boy growing up in rural England. It was 1642. Newton was born prematurely at Woolsthorpe Manor, a small farmhouse in Lincolnshire. He was so tiny and weak, people weren't sure he would survive, and his father was already dead. He had died 3 months before Isaac was born. So for the first 3 years, it was just Isaac and his mother Hannah. Then everything changed. Hannah married a wealthy older man named Barnabas Smith, and Smith didn't want Isaac living with them. So Hannah left her 3-year-old son with his grandparents and moved away with her new husband. Imagine being 3 years old. You don't understand why your mother is leaving. You don't understand where she's going. You only know she's gone. And that childhood experience stayed with Newton. As he grew older, he became intensely private. He could be difficult, he could be angry, and he spent an enormous amount of time inside his own mind. But there was something else about him. He was incredibly curious. He wanted to know how things worked. He built little machines, he drew things, he read constantly. And then something happened that almost changed his entire future. Newton's mother returned to the farm after her second husband died, and she wanted Isaac to help manage the family estate. So, at around 17, Newton was pulled away from school. His future? Farming. Not science, not mathematics, farming. And what happened next? Newton turned out to be a terrible farmer. He wasn't interested in the work. He would rather read than watch the animals. He would sit under a tree with a book while the farm needed his attention. His sheep wandered, problems piled up, and slowly people began to realize something. Isaac Newton wasn't stupid. He was simply interested in something completely different. His schoolmaster saw it, his uncle saw it, and they convinced Hannah to send him back to school. That decision would change history. Newton returned to his education, and in 1661 he entered Trinity College, Cambridge. Finally, he was in a place where his strange mind could run free. But then, 4 years later, something happened that nobody could have planned. A plague. It was 1665. Newton was 22 years old. Cambridge was busy. Students were studying, professors were teaching. Newton was building his future. Then the plague began spreading through England. People were dying, fear was everywhere, and eventually Cambridge University closed its doors. Students were sent home. Newton had no choice. He packed his things and returned to Woolsthorpe, back to the same farmhouse, back to the place connected to his childhood. But this time, Newton wasn't the abandoned 3-year-old. He was a young man with an extraordinary mind. And suddenly, he was alone. No lectures, no professors, no classmates, no distractions. Just Newton and time. A lot of time. And what happened next? This is where the story gets interesting. During this period, Newton worked on mathematics that would eventually develop into calculus. He experimented with light. He took a prism and passed sunlight through it. The result shocked him. The white light separated into colors. Newton realized something important. The prism wasn't creating the colors. The colors were already inside the light. But Newton wasn't finished, not even close. Because somewhere during these years, another question began to occupy his mind. A question about something as ordinary as an apple.
You've probably heard the story. Newton is sitting under a tree. An apple falls. It hits him on the head, and suddenly he discovers gravity. But here's the problem. That famous version is almost certainly not what happened. There is no reliable evidence that an apple actually hit Newton on the head. The real story is much more interesting. Newton saw an apple fall, and instead of simply watching it, he started asking questions. Why does it fall down? Why does it always fall toward the earth? Why doesn't it fall sideways? Why doesn't it fly upward? And then Newton asked a much bigger question. If Earth can pull an apple towards itself, could that same force reach the moon? Think about that. An apple and the moon, two things that seem completely unrelated. But Newton wondered if they were connected by the same invisible force. Maybe the moon was falling too, not straight into Earth, but constantly falling around it. And that idea was enormous. Because if the same force could explain an apple falling and the moon orbiting Earth, then perhaps that force could explain the movement of everything in the heavens. The planets, the moon, the tides, maybe even the entire solar system. Newton had found a question worth chasing. But there was a problem. He didn't publish the answer immediately. In fact, years passed, a lot of years. Newton became increasingly private about his work. He kept many of his ideas to himself. And then another man entered the story. His name was Edmund Halley. Yes, the same Edmund Halley whose name you know from Halley's Comet. Halley was working on a problem. Why do planets move the way they do? He couldn't solve it, so he went to Newton and asked him a simple question. What force could make a planet follow its orbit? Newton's answer shocked him. Newton said he already knew. Halley wanted to see the mathematics, and Newton showed him. What happened next? Halley realized that Newton had something extraordinary, something much bigger than the problem they were discussing. He encouraged Newton to write everything down, and Newton finally did.
In 1687, Newton published his masterpiece, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. The book contained his laws of motion and his theory of universal gravitation. It became one of the most important scientific works ever published. The boy who had been left behind at 3 had grown into a man who was trying to explain the movement of the entire universe. But here's the twist. Newton's greatest breakthrough didn't happen in a famous laboratory. It didn't happen inside a university surrounded by brilliant professors. It happened while he was forced away from Cambridge during a deadly plague, alone at the farmhouse where his difficult childhood had begun. The place that once represented loneliness became the place where he spent some of his most productive years of his life. And that brings us to the strangest part of this story.
Newton's life wasn't a simple story about suffering creating genius. It doesn't work that way. Being lonely doesn't automatically make someone brilliant. Pain doesn't automatically create greatness. Newton had teachers, he had books, he had education. He had people who recognized his talent, and he had Edmund Halley pushing him to publish his work. But there is something remarkable about what Newton did with his circumstances. When the world became quiet, he didn't stop thinking. He went deeper. When Cambridge closed, he didn't know it at the time, but those months away from university would become some of the most important years of his life. And that is the real twist. The plague didn't create Newton, but the isolation gave Newton something he desperately needed: time to think.
So maybe the most important part of Newton's story isn't the apple. Maybe it's the question. Because millions of people had seen apples fall before him. But Newton stopped and asked why. And that tiny question opened the door to something enormous. So the next time you see an apple fall, don't just watch it. Ask why. Because sometimes the difference between an ordinary moment and a moment that changes history is simply the question someone decides to ask. Isaac Newton once looked like a boy who had been forgotten, a failed farmer, a strange young man, someone who didn't quite fit into the world around him. But years later, the world was looking to him to understand how that world worked. And perhaps that's the lesson. You don't always know what your quiet years are preparing you for. You don't always know what a closed door is making room for. And you certainly don't know where one simple question might take you. Newton asked why an apple falls, and humanity ended up learning how the universe moves. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, because the next story might begin with someone history almost forgot.